Good morning, Central Region, and welcome again to our People guest speaker series. And today we have a special emphasis going forward. We've got a guest speaker to take up a majority of the time. So our DEIA Workgroup and Lead for Everyone team are going to combine their time with the culture team to do a presentation. Before we get started on that, though, I just wanted to mention that we are doing an excellent job on completing metric 3 of the blueprint, which is identifying smart practices and goals for your office culture. There are 11 offices that have completed that task, and it is greatly appreciated that the great work is continuing. And I'll be mentioning it also to supervisors and managers in the offices on a management call next week, just as a reminder. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Rodriguez to introduce our guest speaker for the day. Stephen.
Good morning, all. Thank you so much for joining us here this morning. I know the weather seems to be kind of relentless as of late, and everybody's been really kind of busy. And once again, and today's another busy day, so definitely understandable for those that can't make it. But for those that have joined us here, thank you for giving us about an hour of your time. We're really excited about today's talk. And I think, as you may have seen from my various Google chats and all the various Google spaces, I'm pretty excited about this. I think, here today to discuss DEIA culture and Lead for Everyone. And, in previous monthly webinars, we've really kind of maybe somewhat approached this a little separately, kind of all tied related, but, the DEIA culture lead, and we've kind of had our own various individuals speak to the good work that's going across Central Region. But today we're going to, approach that slightly differently and really kind of join forces per se here and really kind of speak to a great topic. Because in reality, when we're thinking about DEIA culture and Lead for Everyone, they're definitely connected. It's about how we create inclusive and safe environments for all of us, for our entire office, for our team. And it's about how we create an office culture supportive of our staff and their families and some of the challenges that they might be going through. And then most importantly, it's about having those individuals that will kind of help us forge ahead and lead us into the future to ensure that we're meeting the needs of not only our partners, but our workforce here. And so on that note here, I'm super excited to introduce Kevin Huyck, and I apologize if I got your last name wrong there, but a meteorologist at the Duluth office, here to speak to us on autism, ADHD, and the concept of neurodiversity. Coming out of the month of April, which was Autism Acceptance Month, we felt it was fitting to continue this conversation, continue to discuss this topic. And as our offices continue to evolve and grow into the future, I think this topic is very important to keep in the forefront of our discussions. And so on that note, Kevin, it's all yours. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, Stephen. I really appreciate it. Yeah, you were very close on the name. It's hike, like you were going to go on a hike. The CK at the end tends to throw people for a bit of a loop, so that's all right. I appreciate the introduction and the warm welcome. Thank you all. So we're going to talk about team building with people on the autism spectrum. Some of the folks that are on the call today may have seen a version of this presentation before, and some folks may have even seen this exact presentation earlier this month in different venues. So I apologize if anybody is seeing it more than once. A little bit of introduction for myself. My name is Kevin, as was mentioned, and I am autistic and I have ADHD, which is a somewhat common dual diagnosis among autistic people. I'm considered to be level 1 autistic, which isn't really a rank or anything, but it describes my support needs. On the spectrum of support needs, I'm on the lowest end of the spectrum. We'll talk a little bit about that more going forward. So this topic is particularly interesting to me and important to me. I've had some struggles over the course of my career, and if I can use some of my experiences to help smooth the path for other people, I think that's a way of creating a benefit out of something that I found to be a challenge. So again, I thank you all for being here. The idea is that we'll have some time for questions toward the end. But again, if you want to mark down my email address, if there's something you want to chat about after the presentation, or if you're not comfortable sharing your question in the recorded portion of the seminar, you can feel free to email me afterward and we can continue the conversation that way. So starting off, what is neurodiversity? So neurodiversity is basically describing this natural diversity of human minds. I think we're all familiar with the concept of diversity when it comes to gender orientation and sexuality. And so this is just another axis of diversity that we find among the human population. There's a couple of vocabulary words here. There's neurotypical, which you'll hear me refer to at times during the presentation. This is considered to be having a mind or a functioning that is deemed normal or common or typical in our society. There's also a term neurodivergent. This is essentially the opposite of the neurotypical. It's an umbrella term that encompasses individuals who have a mind or brain that differs from the expectation or the norm or the standard. And then neurodiverse describes a group that consists of a portion of the neurodiversity spectrum. Not all groups have representations from all the different aspects of neurodiversity, but neurodiverse would describe most of our groups because we typically have some different people and some different ways of approaching things, different way of thinking about problems and solving problems, and just the way our minds work. Even in small groups, there's usually some amount of neurodiversity. So I like this petal diagram. This kind of describes a little bit of the sphere of neurodiversity. So across the top, starting in the upper left there, we have DCD and dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dyslexia, and ADHD, which are typically grouped together kind of under this umbrella of things that would cause us some learning challenges. And among autistic people particularly, and ADHD people, we often see comorbidities between dyscalculia and dyslexia and ADHD and autism. Not all people who are diagnosed autistic or have ADHD will have those other conditions, but a relatively large cross-section of the population does. And then as we continue around the flower petal, we have Tourette syndrome, something called acquired neurodivergence. So this is typically described as a situation where a person is experiencing the world in a neurotypical fashion until some event happens, either an illness or perhaps a traumatic event, and they take on aspects of neurodivergence after that incident or after that event. This is commonly found with complex PTSD, and ADHD tend to have some overlap, and there are other things on here that can be precipitated by illness or by traumatic event. Learning disabilities in general are on the list here, as is mental health and autism. So this is, again, is a broad cross-section. There are other things that would probably fit under the umbrella of neurodiversity that are beyond the scope of the presentation here this morning. So we're going to dive a little bit more into the ADHD portion after that broad overview. So as I mentioned, I am autistic and I also have ADHD. And so, this information applies to my life in places as well as many other people in our agency. So ADHD used to be called attention deficit disorder, and then there was a separate diagnosis of ADHD with the hyperactivity added. And then eventually the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, which is the tool that's used to define and diagnose mental health challenges, combined them in name, but then separated them in type. So now we have ADHD as an umbrella term, and there are typically 3 types under that umbrella. We have the predominantly inattentive type, which presents with 5 or more symptoms of inattention lacking attention to detail, difficulty focusing, trouble listening, failing to complete tasks, poor organizational skills, avoiding tasks or that require sustained focus, losing track of important items. Some of the people are easily distracted, and there's also forgetfulness. And then there's the hyperactive presentation of ADHD, which is often displayed by a person leaving their seat when expected to remain seating, blurting out answers or completing other people's sentences or interrupting, struggling to stay quiet during activities, fidgeting, tapping hands and feet, often moving, unable to sit still, trouble with waiting their turn in group settings, talking excessively, and feeling restless. And so to be diagnosed with either of these two presentations, you need to have 5 items from one list and fewer than 5 from the other list. A lot of ADHD folks, particularly children, will have elements of both, but then over time, as we learn how to interact with our peers and go through our maturing phases, some of the hyperactivity presentation may diminish as a person grows into adulthood. So I would be considered primarily the inattentive type. In the past, I've been said to be the combined type, which has elements of both of these. So in addition to having 5 items on the list, it's important to remember they have to have a significant impact on the person's life. As we look at this list, I think everybody participating can point to moments when they may find themselves matching with some of these items on this list. And again, the lists are not exhaustive. They're just a sample of some of the things that are looked for. And for these challenges to be clinically diagnosed as ADHD, they have to have a significant impact on the way the person is living their life. Everybody's had moments where they have trouble listening or difficulty focusing, or perhaps they're forgetting some important piece of information at times, but it's not pervasive throughout their life, and it doesn't have a prolonged, sustained negative effect on the way they live. So ADHD in the workplace presents in a number of different ways. Again, we're typically dealing with adults who have gone through their childhood and learned how to interact with their peers and people around them and society in general. So a few things that you may see is again, excessive talking, difficulty resting, restlessness, which is sometimes expressed externally so that we would be able to see it, but sometimes it's like an internal restlessness that the people feel as they are experiencing life. Intruding and interrupting with others, difficulty keeping quiet, but also sometimes difficulty being in quiet spaces. And then a few other things that you may see is, again, the errors, avoidance of tedious work, easily distracted, trouble completing tasks. And again, these have to be pervasive and have a significant impact on the way the person lives their life. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to start delving more into the autism side, which is where I typically spend most of the time during these presentations. But before we get too much farther, I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. This is Archie. Archie is going to help me describe a few elements of autism. He's the creation of Rebecca Burgess, and I recommend anyone who's interested to go ahead and check out her website. She has a lot of really helpful descriptors. I won't be using all of them here, but there's a lot of information that she contains and draws it out visually in a very appealing way, at least from my perspective. So one of the first things we're going to talk about is the diagnostic. How does a person get diagnosed as autistic, and what does that actually mean? So again, in the DSM version 5, this is called autism spectrum disorder. However, people in the community do not see it as a disorder. They see it as a neurological difference. And so we prefer the term autism spectrum condition instead of autism spectrum disorder. So you'll see me refer to this as ASC through the presentation and as we refer back to it. So the Diagnostic Statistics Manual version 5 came out a number of years ago, and it unified 5 seemingly related diagnoses under a single autism spectrum condition diagnosis. These include what we would traditionally consider to be autism, Asperger's syndrome, Rett's, pervasive demand avoidance type things. So there's a lot of these that fit under this generic umbrella. Typically includes difficulty communicating and interacting with others, language delay, restricted interests, and repetitive behaviors. And again, for the for a diagnosis of autism, these symptoms have to interfere with a person's ability to function at work, school, and other significant areas of their life. Again, as we talk through some of these conditions, people may identify, oh yeah, sometimes I feel like that. Oh, sometimes I feel like that. One of the things that we hear from time to time in the autistic community and in the ADHD community is, oh, everybody's a little ADHD or everybody's a little autistic. And I think that that kind of concept can be a bit harmful, and it really doesn't dig into the pervasiveness and the impact that these conditions have on people's lives. So when we think about the autism spectrum, a lot of people think about a linear spectrum, as I was describing, during my introduction. And so that linear spectrum is better used to describe the support needs of autistic individuals. And so in the DSM-5, there are 3 support levels for autism. Level 1 is the least support needs. Level 2 is moderate or medium support needs. Oftentimes these are folks that can hold down a job, but they may have a support person that works alongside them. They may have someone who helps at home, who takes care of some of their daily requirements and some of the things that are required to function as an adult. And then you have the level 3 support needs, which are the highest needs. And typically these are people who would struggle to live on their own independently, and they may not be able to hold down employment. They may have limited interaction with people around them and society in general. But when we think about autism spectrum itself, and not just the support needs, what we find is that it's similar to a wheel. So there are these 5 axes on Archie's image here: language, motor skills, perception, executive function, and sensory processing. And so if you think about autism spectrum more like a wheel, and each one of these axes has a slider, and so each individual person's expression of autism is going to vary depending on where the slider is on these different axes. And again, this isn't a complete representation of all the different possible expressions of autism, just a representation to help us understand the concept. And so the reason that I mention this is because there are so many degrees of freedom in autism expression, it's very difficult to generalize the autistic experience from interacting with one person or even a couple of people, because each autistic individual's experience and expression is likely to be different than any other autistic person. We like to say that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and those experiences may not translate equally across the community. Historically, males have been more likely to be diagnosed with autism spectrum condition than females. When we think about the subtype of autism itself, the more classical definition, pre-DSM-5, the rate is about 4-to-1 for autism and about 9-to-1 for Asperger's of male to female diagnosis. A 2020 study estimates that about 1 in 45 adults in the United States has autism spectrum condition. Some folks in the presentation here today may remember this sort of moral panic that seemed to emerge in the late 2000s and early 2010s around this increasing rate of autism in our population, and what is different about our environment and our kids that suddenly we have so many more autistic people. I would argue, and many others would agree with this, that the increasing rate, if you will, is simply a better sampling of the population that already exists. Autism as a diagnostic only existed since the early 20th century. Asperger's came along even later. And if we think back to historical figures, people we might recognize, people who have contributed in a meaningful way to society and science, literature, and we look at the way some of those folks have lived their lives, it seems as though some of them would have been diagnosed as autistic if this diagnosis had been available during their lifetime. So in all likelihood, there's not an increased rate, if you will, but we're just doing a better job of sampling the population that already exists. When a person can be diagnosed earlier in their life, it leads to greater self-esteem and less perceived discrimination as they progress through life. And part of that is because we can get folks additional supports, we can get them some education, some help in learning how to adapt to and cope with their autism. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends screening all children for autism spectrum condition at this point, as we continue to see these increasing numbers. So among autistic people, surveys and studies repeatedly tend to indicate a high motivation and evident ability among autistic people. Now, this may apply to things that would help a person hold down employment. But again, in those level 2 and level 3 support needs, those individuals who need more support and may or may not be able to hold down a job or contribute in some way, still have high motivation and abilities. They may just not be monetizable, if you will, in our society. Autistic people can display a variety of traits which can be beneficial to the workplace. They tend to be trustworthy and reliable, have low absenteeism, high attention to detail. But again, that tends to be in some specific areas. Perhaps not every task gets the same attention to detail. They can perform cognitively demanding or repetitive work more than a neurotypical or a non-autistic colleague, and they can be efficient and cost-effective. And we're going to talk about those last 2 points a little bit more in depth in a few slides here. So autistic people in the workplace have some challenges. They may have deficits in what's considered social understanding, including nonverbal communication. Autistic to non-autistic communication can come across as rude in either perspective. Autistic people tend to be direct. Non-autistic people tend to be, they tend not to get to the point. They tend to dance around the issue and hope that the other person understands what they're talking about, as opposed to simply being straightforward. And that can it can come across as rude and inconsiderate, both, if you're receiving that direct communication and you're not ready for it, you've not experienced that very much, that can come across as rude. When you have somebody that's dancing around the problem or the topic being discussed, and they won't just get to the point. For an autistic person, they could be sitting there saying, okay, when are we going to get to the point? What's going on? Why are you wasting my time with all of this social nicety as opposed to just getting to the point? And so it can come across as rude from either perspective. An autistic person may have trouble understanding humor and sarcasm, particularly when they first meet someone or when they're just beginning to join a group. Everybody has a slightly different use of humor and sarcasm in the way that they communicate, and it takes a little bit of time to learn and understand and adapt to each individual's sense of humor and sarcasm. Some of these communication challenges can lead to misunderstandings and mistaken intent. And that's really important. A lot of the difficulty that autistic people have when interacting with society in general comes from these breakdowns of communication and these misunderstandings. If a person comes up to you and they want to talk about a specific topic and they just get right to it, and you perceive that as rude, you may be less inclined to talk to that person or interact with that person again. You may come away with some difficult emotions that you'd have to process through from having that experience. And you can misunderstand, what the autistic person is meaning. And the same goes the other direction as well. So this is often characterized as what's described as the double empathy problem. An autistic person, for example, may struggle to read between the lines, to overcome people's misconceptions about autism, and perhaps manage sensory distractions. So that last one, I like to take a moment and talk about my experience a little bit. You may notice in the video here, I'm moving my hands a lot. I'm also, moving my body back and forth. Some of that is to deal with my sensory perception. I'm in our conference room right now. I have the lights dimmed so that you can still see me, but it's much lower intensity than if I had the room lights up full. And our operations area has adjustable lights as well. And we typically keep those on the lower end of the illumination spectrum. And most everyone finds that to be very comfortable. Simply sitting in this room, I'm feeling the air moving past me. If it's a little warm, maybe I'm starting to sweat a little bit. And that sensation of having sweat on my skin can be very distracting. A lot of my sensory processing seems to happen in the cognitive processing part of my brain, as opposed to, in the background where other functions are handled. And so along with that concept, I have a fan that I keep at all of our workstations. So if I'm feeling a little warm, I can turn on the fan and be cooler, and that helps me get rid of that distraction. And then, of course, the rocking back and forth. As my clothes sit on here, over the years, I've developed a wardrobe that I find to be very comfortable for myself. But I still feel the sensation of the clothes sitting on my body, and that can be very distracting. And for whatever reason, if I rock back and forth, then there's a calming effect just from the motion, but also any sensation from my clothes or the environment that I can feel. My brain can ignore that by telling myself that I'm the cause of it. And if I were, as long as I'm doing this, my brain can ignore those sensations. It's very strange. In brightly lit rooms, if I'm trying to focus or pay attention to what someone is saying, I may have to close my eyes. Same thing goes for a loud or a noisy environment. I may close my eyes so that I can focus better, because a lot of that processing is happening up in the cognitive portion of my brain as opposed to being in the background. A non-autistic person, on the other hand, may struggle to develop a positive first impression. Again, that comes from that directness, that lack of social awareness that an autistic person may have. They may have difficulty recognizing and understanding autism when they see it. And that's a pretty common problem for a lot of these invisible types of disabilities. Media and society may have created for them an idea of autistic sensory difficulties, but because they're not really living it, they may think that they're either more or less severe, and that can cause issues as well. So in the end, both parties may struggle to understand the other's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and differences. And that's critically important as we look at how to develop stronger teams. Autistic people tend to think differently. That includes what's considered divergent thinking. Typically, when we're going through a problem-solving session or brainstorming, the solutions tend to gradually focus in on one or a couple courses of action. Whereas, for example, divergent thinking, people tend to be more comfortable saying things that may not be obvious, or they may not be that other people may think of, but they may be protecting their ego by keeping those thoughts to themselves a little bit. An autistic person may offer those without those kinds of concerns. So for example, everybody who's worked in operations has dealt with our technology problems of one kind or another. And so if you think critically about that, one possible solution would be to power down your workstation, walk outside, touch some grass, keep going, walk into the woods, disappear, become feral, and you never have to deal with the technology again, right? That is a solution to the problem. It's perhaps not the preferred solution, but it does tick all the boxes of resolving the conflict. And so that's just one example of possible divergent thinking, but there are a lot of others that can bring great ideas that other folks may hesitate to share, or other possibilities that the team members may not see. There's a story that I heard about Orson Welles when he was making Citizen Kane. There was a cinematographer at the time named Greg Toland who wanted to work with him. Now, I'm not suggesting that either of these people is autistic, but this is an example of one of the benefits of this divergent thinking. So Orson Welles asked Greg Toland, "Why do you want to work with me?" And Greg Toland said, "Well, you've never made a picture before. You haven't learned all the things that can't be done. So you are open to possibilities that other people would not consider." And there's a lot of value in that in our teams. There's a quiz that people can take. This is often offered online on a variety of websites. It has 50 questions. It's called the Autism Spectrum Quotient test. And it assesses a degree of autistic traits in a person of normal intelligence. So again, this is a little bit similar to some of the tests that we may have seen on social media, where it describes which Friends character you are, or which My Little Pony character best matches your personality. It's along those same lines, but there's a bit more science and research that goes into it. It's a self-diagnostic test that people can use to learn information about themselves. And if a person scores toward the higher end, typically considered to be a score of about 20 or 21 or higher, 21 to 23 or higher, they may be showing signs of autistic traits and might want to pursue some more information, which may eventually include seeking out an official diagnosis. When we look at people who work in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, they tend to have higher autism quotient scores than the non-STEM population. There's anecdotal evidence that suggests that people with autism spectrum condition self-select for STEM fields. And we'll talk a little bit about why coming up here in a few moments. Some technical companies have actively recruited for autism spectrum condition people, including Microsoft and Ford and JP Morgan Chase. There's a great resource online called the Autism at Work Playbook that has more descriptions, how the people are recruited, and then also how they contribute to the organization. And I recommend anyone who's interested in this line of thinking to take a look at that Autism at Work Playbook. It's a really great resource. Autistic individuals tend to be stronger in systemizing versus empathizing skills. Now, these are mental concepts of how people think and how they organize information. People who are stronger systemizers tend to have attention to detail. They understand and follow rules and instructions. But there's an important thing to note here. So we all have written rules. We've got station duty manual, perhaps. We've got the NWS directive system. And those are all good. And, those are all relatively easy to read and understand and remember. But then we actually have the norms of the place that we work. And that's slightly different. Those are unwritten rules. It describes how we perceive the written rules, how we accomplish the work. and things of that nature. And so this understanding and following of rules and instructions is mainly focused on things that are written down and documented. A person who's a systemizer may struggle to understand the norms and typical behavior of the organization or the group that they're a part of, at least initially. A person who's stronger in empathizing skills, that breaks down into two branches: the cognitive portion, which is understanding one's own and another person's mental state, and also the affective, with an A, which is how we respond to our mental states and other people's. That can include the outward expression. If a person is, really having a hard time, you may see that in their facial expression or in their body language. They may start frowning and furrow their brow a little bit, and, really display the kind of emotion that they're feeling. That's the affective side of empathizing, is being able to see that kind of information and understand what the other person's feeling. People who are stronger systemizers favor STEM fields. That includes meteorology and atmospheric science. They tend to be detail-oriented. Again, that word keeps coming up. And conscientious in their work. They possess an innate ability to find patterns and anomalies in data. Well, let's think about that for a second. As forecasters, what is it that we're doing? We're looking at large quantities of data to try to find anomalies and things that deviate from the norm. And a lot of that is being processed visually. And so these people who are systemizers tend to have skills in doing that kind of thinking. There's another study in 2020 that suggests the autistic community has a greater attention to and interest in weather than the non-autistic population. And perhaps that's an underutilized reservoir of talent that exists in the population at large that we may be able to tap into. People with autism spectrum condition may yield high levels of visual expertise. There was a very interesting study that was conducted either in the late 2000s or early 2010s by a man named Simon Baron Cohen. And he sat down two groups, non-autistic people and autistic people, and put them in front of a computer screen. The computer screen would show a blank screen, and then there would be a screen of noise, and then a blank screen, and then there would be another screen that had some noise, but there was also a character or a shape on the screen that the test subject was supposed to find and identify. Then that screen would go away, there'd be another blank screen, another screen with noise. And so the results of this test were pretty interesting. When there was a low degree of noise and earlier in the examination, the the non-autistic and autistic people scored about the same on their ability to find the character they were looking for. But as the test progressed in time, and as the amount of noise showed to the individual increased, the scores started to diverge, and autistic people tended to be able to perform better with higher degrees of noise than a non-autistic person. So what does that mean? Well, it means that an autistic person may perform tasks requiring visual processing, radar analysis, satellite analysis, looking at forecast model data more efficiently, or be able to deal with a greater degree of noise than their non-autistic counterparts. So there's some skill there that is able to be applied to the work that we're doing. If we consider 18 meteorologists per WFO, odds are relatively high that at least one of those people, and likely several, are autistic. So in all likelihood, we've already worked with or are currently working with a person who's autistic, whether we know it or not. So when you look at a larger organization, a national center, or another group or a university group with more than 18 people, we have an even higher probability of working with at least one autistic person. So a quote here from James Mahoney, who is the head of the Chase Autism at Work program. Our autistic employees achieve on average 48 to 140% more work than their typical colleagues. They're highly focused and less distracted by social interactions. Let's think about that for a second. So what did we say we encounter when we have autistic people and non-autistic people trying to work together and trying to be in the same group? We said that there are sometimes challenges in communication and sometimes challenges in understanding intentionality and things of that nature. And so while this is an interesting take, and I like to include it, this highly focused, less distracted on social interactions is not a great asset for people who want to build strong teams. You have to build a relationship with the people you work with to have a strong team. And a lot of that relationship building is done around the water cooler, around the coffee pot. You know, you come in on Monday morning and you get logged in and ready to work, and you check in with people. Hey, what did you do over the weekend? Hey, anything interesting coming up? And you just kind of have those social nicety conversations. And that's one of the ways that we can build stronger teams and build a more cohesive work group. And yet autistic people, you know, this person says that an autistic person's disinterest in doing those sorts of activities is a benefit to the office. Well, that's probably from like a monetary perspective. It's not great for building stronger teams. So how do we overcome some of these challenges in order to build stronger teams? It's important to foster a workplace which is welcoming and inclusive. This is a recurring theme across many of the studies looking at autistic people and employment. Managers and colleagues and autistic people must learn to communicate, collaborate, and socialize together. We have to make sure our autistic team members are included in off-site activities. An example I like to give for this, if you consider the stories of Winnie the Pooh, the character Eeyore is presented as somebody who's feeling down a lot and seems to struggle with some aspects of life, and generally has a somewhat sour perspective on life. But when you consider the interactions he has with the rest of the group, they don't exclude him from the activities. He's included. He has different levels of being able to participate than some of the other people in the group, but he's always a part of the group. And so when we think about including our autistic team members for offsite social activities, it means mostly, you know, making a welcoming environment and offering an invitation to someone who may not otherwise be included. Now, the autistic experience in life and in the workplace can be emotionally and mentally tiring. And so an autistic person may not always agree to participate, but simply being asked has a lot of meaning to a person who is autistic. Managers and team members should demonstrate behaviors to indicate acceptance of autistic staff members. And this has a spillover effect. If we're demonstrating inclusion and acceptance of our autistic staff members, other types of neurodiversity and diversity in general will feel more comfortable and more welcomed as well. So there's this great spillover effect to some of these things. The responsibility for doing this work and managing these relationships is shared between autistic and non-autistic team members. It's a lot easier to point at the person or the small group of people who are behaving differently than the rest of the group and say that they are responsible for fitting in with the rest. That's a fairly common thing that we do in our society. But I want to emphasize that the responsibility for this should be shared between both sides, the autistic and non-autistic people. Everyone should be putting forth an effort to try to work through these things. I encourage diversity training, including a focus on autism. And there are 4 main types of training that are suggested by the Autism at Work playbook. Managers who participate in autism awareness training become better managers, again, for all employees. So there's this spillover effect. This is repeated over and over and over when we look at autism and employment. Accommodations and changes that are made to accommodate autistic people benefit all of the employees and all of the work group. Ideally, all of the team members should receive this kind of training. However, that's not always achievable due to budgetary and time constraints. And so if we are able to focus at least on getting the management level and our leads some experience and training dealing with autistic people and neurodivergence in general, it again has a spillover effect and helps us provide a better environment and a more inclusive and accepting environment for all of the team members. And again, if we're leading by example, some of the lower graded team members will see that behavior and they will emulate it as well. So one of the things that almost always comes up in these kinds of discussions and when you're talking about disability in general is disclosure. So autism, ADHD, a lot of the things that were on that neurodiversity list, those are all considered to be invisible disabilities. It can be very hard to notice when you look at someone or when you interact with someone that they are struggling with any of those challenges. So the choice to disclose that a person has a disability is deeply personal and has a number of governing factors. The person must weigh the potential positives and negatives. You have to have trust in the people you disclose to. Disclosure can lead to greater acceptance and inclusion and enable accommodations and increase the workplace and societal awareness of autism in general. On the other hand, and even in even within our own work groups, office culture plays a big role in this. And there are still places where the office culture is not perhaps where we would want it to be. And so in those situations, disclosure can lead to further alienation, stigmatization, and actually discrimination at times. So there is a risk with any of this disclosure. We have to ask ourselves, is our team a safe place where people trust each other enough to be able to disclose without the fear of having it held against us? By the time an autistic person reaches working age, they have been subjected to isolation and having trust betrayed a number of times over the course of their lives, usually in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of instances over the course of a person's life by the time they reach the workplace. So what are some of the steps that our organizations take to foster an inclusive workplace? Have we thought critically about those things, and how are we implementing them? When we're talking about accommodation, disclosure is often necessary to open the door to accommodation. Not necessarily disclosing to everyone, but to supervisors and managers may need to know that information, as well as the workplace accommodation person with NOAA. A few possible accommodations could include a more isolated workspace. If you have trouble with distractions and you need a quieter space to work, there are places in our offices where that may be available. However, that's not always achievable. When we're doing warning operations, it's oftentimes, you oftentimes have to have the people clustered together a little bit so that they can communicate with each other. And so there needs to be a little bit of give and take when we're talking about accommodations. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide here. There may be adjustments to mitigate sensory processing issues, having the ability to control the temperature at your workstation, either through the heating and cooling system or perhaps by having a fan, or in some cases, I've worked with a number of colleagues who tend to be chilly on their operations floor. And so maybe it involves having a source of heat at the workstation so that they can be comfortable. Perhaps it means headphones at times, some kind of noise reduction. Special lighting or adjustable lighting are all very helpful things at times to reduce that sensory input and allow more of the cognitive part of the brain to be able to actually focus on and perform work. These are not exhaustive lists. There are many, many types of accommodations that may be available to a person. In order to be successful with your accommodations, you have to ask for exactly what you need and what your experience is and how the accommodation will help you. You have to be willing to be flexible with management. Try to find something that's in the middle. There are some accommodations that you'll ask for and it'll be granted because there's relatively low impact. There are other things where there may need to be some negotiation back and forth to try to find some happy middle ground. And of course, there are some things that are simply not possible in our workplaces. And we may encounter that as well. Accommodations go a long way to helping someone feel comfortable and reach their highest potential. And it's important to remember that not only autistic people, but a person with ADHD and other types of neurodivergence, their accommodation needs may change over time. And so this is a conversation that may have to happen several times over the course of a person's career. So again, overcoming challenges in order to strengthen our teams. Here's Archie again saying, sometimes if a person is diagnosed as on the spectrum and informs another person, it's so they can get understanding and respect for the things they're unable to do. But it's also that they want to cooperate with the world around them so that they can be the best at what they can do. So when we're dealing with autistic people and ADHD people, it's important to understand how each individual communicates and adapt to their abilities. Many autistic people have a preference for identity first or person first descriptions of autism. I choose identity first. I am an autistic person. My autism is an inseparable part of my personality and my lived experience. And so saying that I'm an autistic person has a lot of meaning for me, as opposed to a person with autism. Some folks have a very strong preference. If somebody says, oh, Kevin's a person with autism, I'm not going to get particularly upset. But when I describe myself, I use that identity first language. If you want to know how a person wants to be referred to or wants to be described, you can always ask them and then try to respect their wishes. It might be particularly important to them. It's important that we presume competence. Ask an autistic person to do a task just as you would any other. Let me try that again. You can ask an autistic person to do any task that any other employee could be expected to perform. Now they may need that. They may need some instructions in writing, or they may need it delivered in a different way. But always assume competence unless you're able to prove otherwise. Focus on the autistic person's skills and talents and expertise. Everybody has those traits, and it's important to find out what they are and be able to maximize them to have effective and contributing members of our teams. Learn what the traits are and how they best fit with our organization. Autistic people value having a good social relationship in the workplace, even if it's difficult to establish. And autistic people can segue their special interests into an icebreaker to facilitate relationship building. In those situations, think about reciprocating or asking questions. This is another common autism, ADHD to non-autistic, non-ADHD challenge. A person who's talking about their special interest is oftentimes trying to engage or, bring you into their world. And the neurotypical response is to listen and nod our heads and, pay attention. And what the individual who's speaking may want you to do is to share something about yourself or to reciprocate and say, oh, that's interesting. That's your interest. Well, here's an interest of mine. And to engage in that reciprocity. It turns out that if you have autistic people in a group, they tend to get along with each other better than autistic and non-autistic people. And part of it is the understanding of this dynamic. I'm going to share with you something about me. It's something about my experience. I want you to share something about you so I can get to know you better. And so there's this exchange that happens that in neurotypical behavior, that process breaks down because we're wanting to listen to the other person and not steal the spotlight for ourselves. Another interesting point here is, over the years, I've been fairly forthcoming with my interest of trains and railroads. And it turns out that a broad cross-section of the people who are interested in meteorology and atmospheric science also have an interest in trains and railroads. So I don't know if there's really anything to say there, other than you never quite know who might share your interests until you start talking about them. When an autistic person's strong interests overlap with their job, they have a strong motivation to succeed. So if you take a person with a strong innate interest in weather and you place them in a situation where they can work in meteorology or atmospheric science, they will likely do well. Autistic people and colleagues, managers will all stumble and make mistakes. And so when that happens, it's important to recognize when we've erred and apologize and try to repair that relationship. Ask how a person can do better the next time. Often that's a great way of learning. Many managers report that autistic people are a benefit to the work group and the organization as a whole. And it's important to remember that we're already here, we're capable, and we want to contribute both to our groups and to our mission. That's all I have for this presentation. I want to say thanks to a couple of people. Matthew Bolton has provided quite a bit of help developing this presentation, and he's been a great sounding board as I've pursued this avenue of advocacy. Laura Nash, I shamelessly grabbed some of her content from a presentation a couple of weeks ago on ADHD. I thought she did a great job of describing it, so I borrowed those toward the beginning of the presentation. Shout out to Justin there at Davenport, who a conversation back in 2018 set me on this path. We were on shift together and just having a chat, and he said, you should share your experiences. I'm sure there are other people who would benefit from hearing it. So thank you, Justin. And then a couple of Sues that I've had the pleasure of working with, Dan Miller and Patrick Ide, provided quite a bit of encouragement, support, and mentoring during this process as well. Well, like I said, that's all I have. We've got a couple of minutes here. If anybody wants to toss out some questions, please feel free.
Go right ahead, Joseph. There, I see you.
Hi, Kevin. It's Joe Phillips with the Marquette office. First off, thank you so much for this presentation. This was really good. The presentation talked a lot about the challenges with communicating between both ends of those that do have that are on that spectrum and those that may not be. And so with a lot of our communication in this agency being short text message type stuff, either through collaboration, RMA, email, do you have any recommendations on how we should approach specifically those venues when it comes to text? Kevin, I believe you're muted.
Yep, thank you. Appreciate that. There's nothing specifically regarding autism or ADHD that relates to that, but just in general, it's important to try to remember that communication through writing loses a considerable amount of the information that's being conveyed. Communication, I've seen different numbers before, but there's something like 80 or 90% of communication is body language. And when you're sitting down and typing everything, you lose all of that information. And so it's important to try to be mindful that we're only getting a piece of the story when we're looking at written communication. And this is one of the things that's a particular challenge, is try to imagine the best intent of the person that we're dealing with. We don't know what anybody else's struggles are or what they're encountering in their life or even in their daily situation or on the particular day. And so if we approach our communication or interactions with kindness and mindfulness, I think it goes a long way to improving the perception and also improving our relationships when we're dealing with written communication.
Great. Thank you, Kevin.
Kevin, there was a question in the chat there that says, what sort of challenges do you see for autistic people as far as the NWS trends towards more DSS face-to-face support with partners?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Thank you, Marvin. So it doesn't really, it's not really all that different dealing with outward interactions outside of our organization as with inside of our organization. We have to do the best we can to build relationships, particularly before we're in those support situations, so that we have established a relationship, so that the partners we're serving are familiar with us and us with them. But then, those interactions tend to be limited. They tend to be focused on the event specifically. And so again, the attention to detail and the tendency to not conform to the social niceties may be an asset there. You're not going to necessarily spend a lot of time checking in with somebody when you're in a support role. You're figuring out what their needs are and then figuring out how we can address them and deliver the service they need to execute their mission. And so there may be quite a few benefits to the way an autistic person may interact. But again, it requires a little bit of mindfulness and giving a person the benefit of the doubt, because it's very easy to get to come away with those, I guess, those emotions that may be on the more challenging side that we may experience. And so trying to get out of that mindset and realize that the other person has a good intent and is trying to do their best to interact with us is important to having successful relationships. Does that answer your question there, Marvin?
Go ahead, Kurt.
Yes, if I kindly may here. First and foremost, thank you again so much for presenting to the group here. Not only is the content incredible, but just your speaking, the way you speak and your candor and your pace and your tone is excellent. So thank you again and great presentation. Kind of a follow-up on the question that Marvin had. I spent the last 5 minutes asking this question and deleting it and then re-asking it in my mind. I'm curious about how we can, so our agency is going towards IDSS, face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball, partner to partner. Mm-hmm. Without kind of trying to overgeneralize too much, basically just asking if you have any tips or advice for someone like myself in the WCM role or management role of how we can support someone that might be on have the autism spectrum condition. How can we support you all? If there's anything else, if there's anything that you recommend that we consider, or anything we can do to help accommodate people with the condition if they're deploying on site, especially in high intensity, lots of stimuli situations.
That's a really good question, Kurt. Thank you. So I think back to my own experience. I build, what I call mental models of how interaction should go based on experiences that I've had and behaviors that I see in other people. And so, in different situations, I'll adapt one model or another model depending on what's going on. And so in those cases, I find that having some practice or some training about how to do the interactions, the kinds of things that are beneficial for those interactions, ways of behaving, I just had a very positive comment from somebody I work with that reminded me that when I walk into the office in the morning, I should greet people and say hello at least, and that goes a long way to helping to build those kinds of relationships. It's not necessarily the thing I think about when I first walk in the door, so it was a good reminder to have, and something I'm doing my best to incorporate in my behavior. So just some of those things, some of those social niceties that may not be obvious, but also may be expected in that environment. You don't have time to sit down and have a nice long conversation with all of our partners when we go in to support an event, but it is important to, be polite and, be mindful about how we're presenting ourselves and presenting the information, and attentive to the needs and wants of the partner we're serving. That's the best answer I can come up with, Kurt, at the moment. And then I see Marvin asked a follow-up question. How about recruiting and building trust with partners? That's a question I don't really have a good answer for. I'm not real sure how if there's any particular strategies or strengths that an autistic person may particularly bring to the challenge of recruiting and building trust with partners, other than simply reaching out, getting in contact, and having discussions about needs and services that we offer, and seeing where they match up. I don't perceive that as being particularly different from an introductory standpoint, as any other employee may be expected to do.
Any other questions out there for Kevin while we've got him here? One last call here. I agree there, Justin. Kevin, I remember hearing your talk, I think back in 2019 at the lacrosse leadership conference there. And I just kind of remember how moved I was. And that, the idea, the eye opener, for me at the time, and just, the people that we work with and some of the interactions that we have that we may think may be because of a certain way may not be that way. And whether or not, you're working with somebody, that's on the spectrum or not, or has ADHD, it's just this idea of taking a step back and having that, eye-opening thought that maybe I should put myself in someone else's shoes, and just kind of think outside of my own perspective. And so I just remember thinking back then, the perspective that you brought me, I've really appreciated it. I've kind of worked on that throughout the years. And then, even this last year, I've kind of had some additional perspective there, but both my children were diagnosed with ADHD. So it's been a learning opportunity for our entire family here. And so your talk here this morning was absolutely fantastic. And I'll give a plug for neurodiverse NOAA, which for me, in my learning journey, has been just a great resource. And so I can't, promote them enough if, you are, an ally at the very least to kind of learn more there. So sorry for my long-winded chat there, but I really appreciated you speaking here this morning. Thank you so much for the time you've given us. It sounds like you give this talk a lot. And so this is a pretty big commitment for you. And so for you to kind of continue to do that for our region, even for people outside of our region here that I think we're on this call is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much for your time. And that's pretty much what I have to say. If there's any last questions, I know we're way past here, but once again, I appreciate your time there, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm very passionate about this topic, and as I've been talking about it over the years, I've come into contact with a lot of great folks working for the Weather Service and for NOAA that are also on the autism spectrum. So having these conversations is incredibly beneficial to including the people who already exist in our organization.
All right, looks like we're ready to close this out. So in doing that, again, Kevin, I extend my my thank you for this. The topics you talked about today, the information you shared is incredible because it applies not only to us accepting folks who are formally diagnosed and have been, you know, said you've got a concern. A lot of the behaviors you've talked about exist as many of us deal in the workplace. And to be aware and patient with each other is so huge. And just making us aware is the first step for us being able to respond properly. So again, thank you, sir. Greatly appreciated. All right, we will see you the first Wednesday of January for our next guest speaker series on people. So everyone, keep it safe out there with all the weather that's happening. And again, thank you for joining us today.